Whenever we fall into the villain narrative, we have forgotten who our true enemy is. In Ephesians Chapter 6, it says that we are fighting a battle not against earthly forces, but against spiritual forces of darkness. And as dramatic as that sounds, I believe it to be true.
Welcome to Let's Be Real, a completely honest, entirely practical conversation about how to live our lives with freedom, purpose, and abundance. Popular author and communicator Nicole Unice brings her 20 years of experience as a counselor, pastor, and coach to a real conversation about the tricky questions and tough decisions in life, and how to find clarity in action no matter what obstacle you may face. Have a topic to suggest or a tricky situation you need help with? We'd love to hear from you. Send us an email or voice memo to nicole@nicoleunice.com where we might feature you on the show. And now here's your host, Nicole Unice.
Welcome, friends, to Let's Be Real, where we are talking about the things that matter in our life and how they impact us and how we can continue to pursue a life that we love, a life with freedom and purpose and joy in it. And believe me, we need all the help we can get. That is a new sort of axiom that I've been living by these days, which is we need all the help we can get. This is not a time for competition. It is a time for collaboration, which means we just want to reach out and say, I need help. I need help to be a better person. I need help being better in my marriage with my children. I need help focusing and understanding how to be my best in my career or my calling or even the way that I spend my leisure time. So that's what we're all about right now, is just leaning into the fact that we need all the help that we can get in times like this. So we're going to be talking today, kind of continuing the conversation that we started in our last episode around the villain and victim narrative. So we talked last time about unraveling the victim narrative, and I want to talk about combating the villain narrative. Now, you see, I'm taking on stronger language when it comes to the villain narrative that we carry. I mean, truly, y'all, we have this we just are writing these crazy fairy tale stories in our minds so often, and it's operating under the surface. And we don't necessarily know that it's happening, but it is damaging our expression and understanding of ourselves and the way that we engage with each other and particularly the world. So it's worth paying attention to. And all through, I've just been loving our coaching circles, and all through those coaching circle opportunities as well as with clients, I keep hearing this same sort of tendency and trap. And it's something that I think many, many of us struggle with and just don't even know that we're doing it. And we don't know the effects that it has on us sort of in the long term. So I want to talk about what the villain narrative is, what it sounds like, why we do it, and what we can do about it. So let's dive into this whole idea of what is the villain narrative and what does it sound like. So last episode, we talked about this idea of slowing down the narrative in our mind when we're engaging with people and when we're engaging with our own self-talk, and how easy it is to fall into this I can't, I'm not able to, this sort of helpless victim narrative. And we have to kind of pull that apart and gently bring ourselves to a new place. Well, the villain narrative is just as positive, as powerful, but it requires a real attack to keep ourselves from going in this direction. The villain narrative is this engagement sort of language in our mind where certain people are against us. It's this idea that whole people groups might be against us. Perhaps we've been hurt in the past by someone, and instead of focusing on healing from that wound from that individual, it becomes a projection upon everyone within that people group. We see this in individual lives all the time. I just had a client that I was speaking with who felt frustrated because she was pursuing a dream and felt like people were against her. People did not support her. So we kind of dove into what did she mean when she said people didn't support her. And as we began to talk through that and think about who are these people, we sort of narrowed down and realized, no, actually, it's not that people are against her. It's that she felt particularly like one of her parents did not support her. And that one parent kind of was blown up in her mind to be this whole army of people. Now, of course, that's an important person in her life. And oftentimes the more important a person is, the more we value their approval, the more likely we are to blow them into as if they're a whole group of people. But we can do this in all kinds of ways. And what happened in her mind is now it's not that she has one person, one individual to negotiate or contend with. It's that she now in her mind has an entire group of people who are against her, which feels very powerful and very hard to move forward through. So what it looks like is that we create a narrative where people are against us, where people are in sort of a more, to take it to a darker place, we actually dehumanize people and sort of make them the enemy. And so this can look like kind of a way that we might see a group of people who are idiots, or we might give them a name, let's say. And instead of like thinking of people as individual people who have faults and strengths, we think of the whole group of them as people that we're against. And we can blow this out from just our personal relationships and look at our culture and our world. We really don't have to look any further than the news to know that we have this very tribalized culture that we're living in, where we have segmented people groups into sort of for us or against us. You can use an example would be Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter is combated by Blue Lives Matter, by All Lives Matter. Somehow it's not okay for it to be one thing. It's got to be multiple things. We see this with political parties, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, the evangelical culture, everyone else in the culture. All of these like for and against groups, where what we've done is we've stopped thinking about individuals as individual human beings, and we've categorized them into a group that we call a name, that we label. And in that label, we can then say that is a group of people that is for me, whatever we're doing in our mind, or against me. And that way I can sort of categorize people into these camps. And when I'm dealing with those people, I can think of them less as human beings and more as sort of this like group or an enemy or a villain. And so we fall into this using a villain narrative to categorize and judge how our lives are going and what we can trust and who we can trust and how we can know how to navigate the world. So why do we do that? Because we all do it in some way or another. I think the reason that we do it, some of the reasons that we can do it, is because it's simpler. It's just easier to put people into groups and decide early on, can I love them or do I hate them? Are they for me or are they against me? Is this something I can trust or something that I can't trust? We're tired. We're tired of making decisions, and it's simpler to just think of people in groups. We like cartoon characters better than we like human beings. And whenever we fall into the villain narrative, we have fallen into thinking of people more like cartoon characters and less like people. Well, we obviously know that that is a problem because people are inherently beautiful in their dignity and worth. Even people that we don't agree with, even people who hurt us, even people who are violent, they still are born with inherent dignity and worth. And so when we fall into the villain narrative, we are actually dehumanizing people. Jesus himself was very against dehumanizing anyone. If you read in the Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, John in the Bible, you'll see the way that Jesus interacts and engages with people. He's constantly combating the prejudice of groups and groups that are for or against. In fact, he alarms religious leaders because they like the groups. They like knowing who's in and who's out, who's good and who's bad, who's evil and who is, a hero. And Jesus is always talking about how what is really going on is in the heart. And so he sort of like removes all of those categories. But in our human nature, we will fall into those categories again and again. It's simpler to imagine people in groups. It's much more complex and complicated when we actually engage with people for who they are, which are people who are mixed in motive, who are fallible, who can hurt us and who can love us, who can wound and who can heal, who have strengths but also have weaknesses. That is a lot more difficult to contend with. Maturity is knowing that everyone has a shadow side and accepting them for their person, not for their behavior. The simpler thing about the villain narrative is we don't have to accept people as people, and that provides us some protection because we're not going to get hurt if we allow the distance to remain. Love is always harder than distance, but love is also vulnerable. So when we open ourselves up to see people as human beings, we have a stronger discernment process that's required. We have more risk to take. It takes more courage to do that. We may have our mind changed. These are not things that we enter into easily as human beings, which is why it's so easy to fall into the villain narrative. Here's another way that the villain narrative can look. And I see this particularly as a parent. This is where you see the villain narrative play out so easily. It's when, instead of calling out a bad behavior in someone, you actually label them a bad person. So it's the difference between saying that move was stupid or you are stupid. That is a massive difference. Calling out bad behavior is far different than calling a person bad, because we've now labeled them as in the whole of who they are is now this label that we've put on them, whether that label is dumb, idiot, stupid, not enough, whatever. And that label becomes sort of this global definer of a human being, and it also dehumanizes people. Whereas when we focus on the behavior, which we can all do dumb things, we can all do idiotic things, we can all do stupid things, we can do stupid things. It doesn't make me a stupid person. And so I want to encourage you to watch for the ways that you create those labels in your life as a protective mechanism to keep you from getting hurt, the way that you use those labels in your life to keep you from having to grow into, let's say, reconciliation, into forgiveness, into compassion. Growing in that way is not easy. And so this is a road for those who are willing to take a rigorous journey into becoming the fullness of themselves, into becoming more loving, more open, more kind. If you want to move in that direction, one of the first things that you can do is really, really start to guard against this villain narrative that you will see play out in your life when you're watching the news, when you're looking or judging a certain people or behavior. We see it in generational differences. We see it in occupational differences. We see it certainly in our families. So the problem with the villain narrative is it allows us to deflect our own issues, which is a huge deal. It keeps us from growing. If you maintain a villain narrative, you don't actually have to grow because none of your own opinions will be challenged. But what also happens, and the real problem is the villain narrative shrinks your life. It does not expand your life. And God has called us to a growing life. He's called us to a full life and a free life. And the more we play into the villain narrative, the more we become set in our own opinions, in our own prejudices, the more we become set in our own thinking. And what we find is that our world actually becomes smaller and smaller. And if I'm going to be super honest with you, because this podcast is called Let's Be Real, it's also really unattractive. It is not like a person that you want to be around. When people shrink in their expression of openness to humanity, and whenever we fall into the villain narrative, we have forgotten who our true enemy is. In Ephesians Chapter 6, it says that we are fighting a battle not against earthly forces, but against spiritual forces of darkness. And as dramatic as that sounds, I believe it to be true, that there are forces at work to divide and destroy us. And whenever we focus on behavior, not a person, when we love a person and have boundaries around behavior, we are contributing to bringing more light and goodness into the world. Differences. So perhaps the next time you disagree with someone or you disagree with the news, instead of thinking about that person with a label, you might think, wow, I don't agree. That person is a person who's working really hard right now, but I don't agree with what they're saying. That's a very different approach. And that's a way that you can begin to combat this narrative within. So here's what you can do about it when you see this crop up in your life. I'm going to give you a couple of steps that I think can help you that I've sort of kind of circled around already, but let's just land on these 4 things as we close out this idea. So the first one is this: commit to who you want to be. I'll return to this over and over again. We want to have a higher vision for who we're becoming and who we want to be, because then we can prioritize our behaviors underneath that higher vision. Rather than living in a place where we're just living in a set of rules, just like the do's and do nots of life. Like I gotta not do this and I gotta do this. I can't do this and I've got to start doing this. I've stopped doing this. That's a very small way to think. If you want to live into a vision for who you can be, you need to commit to who you want to be. What do you want people to say about you at your 80th birthday party? What kind of character do you want to have? What are some of those values that you want to embody? And I would only choose maybe 3 or 4. And I think that these can shift in different seasons. So don't get caught up in having to lay out your whole life plan before you can commit to anything. Just think about the things that you look up to in other people. What values do you like in others? And then say, yeah, is that the person I want to become? When you commit to who you want to be, it is much easier to prioritize the do's and do nots of your life because you're moving towards something rather than kind of managing and reacting to the day-to-day that you're in. So we want to commit to be someone. So let's say you want to commit to being a more kind person or a more compassionate person or an open person. And you want to be able to say at your 80th birthday, wow, that person, someone your grandchild is saying about you, I love your kindness. Okay, now you're committing to who you want to be, so that when you see villain victim play out in your life, you can stop and say, how is this playing into who I want to be? What do I need to change in order to continue to move to the person that I want to be? The second thing you want to do is focus on the behavior, not the person. So please hear me say, I am not saying that we accept willy-nilly, without any boundaries, the actions and words of people who can hurt us or the actions and words of unsafe people. There are unsafe people out there. There are people who do evil things. There are people who are pursuing wickedness. That is true. But what you want to do is focus on the behavior, not the person. And when you focus on the behavior instead of the person, you're able to set boundaries. You might even have to remove that person from your life, but you're not villainizing the actual person or people like them. See, because that's the problem. When we villainize people, we begin to villainize not only them, but people like them. And then our life is getting smaller, not bigger. So when we focus on the person, focus on the behavior, not the person. Third is name calling versus calling out behavior. There's a difference between labeling a person and actually calling out the behavior. And what we're going to need to do in order to call out behavior that is unsafe or that is evil or that is dark or that is not kind is we want to call that out and have boundaries around how we handle behavior like that while also fostering compassion for the person themselves. You probably know this, but many people, it's a rare tragic story of evil that doesn't involve that person, the perpetrator, the villain in the story, having been hurt earlier in their life. You see, hurt people. We know this. And what we want to do is we can't just allow all of that to come into our lives, all of that behavior to come into our lives. But we can love a person, foster compassion for who they are and how they have been fallen into whatever they're struggling with, while also guarding against the behavior. That is possible. That's the antidote to the villain and the victim narrative, is actually pursuing compassion and healthy boundaries, both, not one without the other. So remember, I love this line from Hunger Games. In the movie The Hunger Games, Katniss, who's sort of the hero of the story, she is trying to win this game, and she's got these people and she doesn't know if they're for her or against her. And at one point in the story, as her life is on the line and one of her people that she thinks is her competitor is actually protecting her, he says to her, never forget who your true enemy is. Whenever we fall into the villain narrative, we have forgotten who our true enemy is. In Ephesians Chapter 6, it says that we are fighting a battle not against earthly forces, but against spiritual forces of darkness. And as dramatic as that sounds, I believe it to be true, that there are forces at work to divide and destroy us. And whenever we focus on behavior, not a person, when we love a person and have boundaries around behavior, we are contributing to bringing more light and goodness into the world. Whenever we fall prey to the villain narrative or the victim narrative, we are shrinking away from the power that we've been given to bring goodness and light into the world. So choose goodness and light. Choose to love a person, not the behavior, to separate name calling from calling out behavior, and to foster compassion and healthy boundaries. Okay, guys, I'll talk with you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to Let's Be Real with Nicole Unice. We'd love to hear from you. Have a topic to suggest or a tricky situation you need help with? Send us an email or a voice memo to nicole@nicoleunice.com and we may feature you on the show. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode.